Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for another installment of Exploring Our World, where here at Colonial Williamsburg, we dive into the minds and experiences of daily life in the 18th century. In celebrating Women's History Month, all of our Exploring Our World programs this month focus on the lives of Williamsburg women. I'm Dr. Kelly Brennan, a historian here at Colonial Williamsburg, and I am joined today by Cody Grant, Davia Brown, and Ren Tolson. Thank you all for joining us today. We're looking forward to answering your questions, so please post them in the comments. This will be a frank and open discussion, and we want to warn you that some topics may not be suitable for a younger audience. We're going to get started, and I think this is a great one. Just generally, what are the things, something that you want, a myth that you want busted, something that you know and you want everybody else to know?
One big one is that the lives of all women in the 18th century were the same. They were not. There are so many different experiences and factors in the lives of 18th century women that can affect their opportunities, their challenges, their successes, their different things that make their lives different. Like even women within the same group are going to have completely different experiences and different ways to look at some of those challenges that they faced in the 18th century. So a woman who is in the gentry class might not look at things the same way a woman who was working class. A woman who was a free black is not going to look at things the same way a woman who was an enslaved black is. A married woman and an unmarried woman probably aren't going to look at things the same way. A woman with children as opposed to a woman without children is probably not going to look at things the same way. Women of different faiths, like all these things represent what we call intersectionality. So you cannot say that all women's lives are the same in the 18th century because not all women are the same. Even women, again, within the same group are very different.
Very well said.
Thank you.
Actually, just launching off of that, the myth that women couldn't work, women couldn't own property, they never really left the house or anything like that, that's just not true. Women absolutely could work, and they absolutely did work, with couple four, really, exceptions, and even those four exceptions, soldier, doctor, lawyer, sailor, there are examples of women doing all of those things. So even with the exceptions, it's not really true. But women did absolutely work. Women absolutely could own property. It's different depending on who you are and where you are and how much money you have, what that looks like. But they could absolutely do those things. We have women tradesmen in town, Clementine Ryan and all that, that absolutely did own things and work and for themselves, and just this idea that women are perpetual victims, that's just not true. Throughout history, just like modern day, women are not perpetual victims. Women are active change makers. They are making decisions. They are changing the world around them. They're commanders in their own narrative, even if things are happening to them that's not controlling their entire lives.
I would say it's very much along the same lines of what you both said, is the idea of not all women are the same, right? So when we think about American Indian people in the lens of American film and TV and movies, it paints a very small frame of who American Indian people are, which then says a very small frame of who American Indian women are. But if you think of in the 18th century, there are thousands of different tribes, which means there are going to be thousands of different cultures, family structures, and government systems that women are occupying in spaces they're interacting in.
And one of the other things, this one makes me nuts, is the idea of women can't participate in the government or politics in any meaningful way. And that's not true. There are a lot of qualifiers on this. And when we talk about women in terms of interacting sort of with the law and talking about what Ren brought up with property and the idea of different women being different, comes in the English tradition of whether or not you're married. So there are two sort of legal statuses a woman may fall under. I should say white women could fall over. They are either, they may be a femme sole, which means they are by themselves, they're sole, means they're not married. And there are certain things that they can do that married women cannot. So things like own property, make contracts in their own name. These are things that married women cannot do. Now, having said that, the preference in the period for white people is that they're actually legally married. So it's an interesting, for the women who where this is a choice, It's a big deciding process. The other thing too about this system, the English legal system, is not only does it affect sort of what the white people in Virginia do, it also permeates the way they see free and enslaved black people and American Indians, particularly how they see women. I love this question. How did women navigate a world where they didn't have a lot of power? Ren and then Cody.
So we see so many examples of women working within these weird legal systems that they have and using it to their own advantage. If you say that a married woman cannot represent herself in a court of law, cannot be the person, cannot be sued, contracts and such have to be done under her name. We have at least one case of a woman where her husband, they lived separately, and he was not in the state, and so they kept trying to bring her to court, and she finally went, fine, I can't, as I am married, you can't bring me to court. You're going to have to go track down that husband of mine. It really seems like something you should be bringing up to him. I mean, we see those examples of women using the law and bending it and using it to their own advantage because they know the full issues with the law. They clearly are understanding of it. And I will say as well, part of the religious aspect of the 18th century, I've seen a sermon, we talked about it earlier, I've seen a sermon from the 18th century where they talk about voting, and the minister said that a man is meant to vote for the household. So his wife does not have a vote, but she does, because if a man is not voting with her input included, then he is not voting for the household. He is not voting in a godly manner. She does have say. It's just not how we necessarily recognize it modern day, but that's not to say it's not power. That's not to say they aren't wielding it to the fullest extent they are, right?
Yeah. One thing I would mention is kind of like the notion of where they have that power, right? So outside or within a community, women have a lot of power and authority over their families, over their voting rights, etc. But when they leave that community and they travel into a foreign nation, right? So think about that. Leaving, for instance, Cherokee country, coming here to Williamsburg, that is traveling to a foreign nation. And so when they're here, they are playing guest to their host, which are English folks, and the politics are going to play out very differently. So in one instance, we can think of when those women travel here, even though they're dignitaries, they're not being allowed in any of the government buildings to engage in those political discussions. But those men who are sitting in council are receiving what the governor is requesting or what they're offering, taking that word back to the encampment where the women are to say, all right, here's what we talked about. Here's what they said. Here's what they're discussing. What's your input? What do you think about it? And so even though to the English they're deliberating with men, the women are really the neck that's turning the head when they come into meeting council.
I also want to see what you have to say about this. We've had fabulous answers, and I just want to keep going.
Oh, I mean, I don't think I can add much more than what you both touched on, because again, there's so many things that have to do with how that power is exercised. And I think one thing when it comes to politics, especially today, is there are people today who can't vote. There are people today who can't hold office, but they're still affecting change within their communities. Exercising your voice doesn't necessarily have to be an action that's so obvious and public. It could be something very subtle. It could be even, again, within just your household. And then for especially two communities within Williamsburg where you do have households that are headed by women, they are exercising a lot of power and authority because they're trying to protect themselves. If they have children, they're trying to protect their children. One thing that I came across a lot in my research is how important it was for free black mothers to make sure that if they put their children into apprenticeships, one, they want to do that because they want to make sure that their children are getting the skill of a trade so that they can provide for themselves, but also they want to make sure that that contract does not become slavery, because there's always individuals who will try to take advantage of these free black children and take them from apprentice to enslaved. And these free black mothers are the first line of defense against that. So they are exercising their power as a protection and as a means to try to provide for themselves and their families.
That's wonderful. Excellent answers always. I am going to say that if you have questions for us, that you would write in the comments, and we hopefully will get to them soon. please feel free to do so. This is a conversation, not with just us, but with you as well. How do you handle, when we talk about research, how do you handle the quote-unquote lack of research in primary sources? Because there's scholarly debate, whatever. When you guys are working and you got to talk to the public and you got to share and you got to know, what do you do? How do you deal with this? Actually, I'm going to go around. Cody, you want to start?
Oh, sure. Like I said, I work with the American Indian Initiative, so our main focus is on American Indian people, right? And however fortunate or unfortunately you want to view this opinion, but in the 18th century, when Europeans are beginning to arrive here into the Americas, they are looking at the American Indian people as kind of the flora and fauna of the New World. And so there's a very kind of concept of a natural study of who these people are, what they do, what they eat, how they live, and interact with the world around them. And so there's pretty good documentation that we can find about different tribes in the who, what, when, where. But the one thing we're usually missing is the why to those things. And I remember something we were discussing earlier, the idea of oral histories, right? Mm-hmm. So when we think about American Indian people, they're not just historical people, they're also contemporary communities that exist today who maintain a system of oral histories. And so by collaborating with these tribes, we're able to go and take the documentations that we have and to say, hey, have you ever heard a story about this? Or does this sound familiar? And we're able to kind of fill in those voids with historical documentation as well as oral history.
So a lot of our guests who come here say that us interpreters are very knowledgeable, and they're right, but we do not know everything. It's possible for anyone to know everything, and we are honest in admitting when we don't know something, because one of the worst things you can do if you're teaching is to give opinion or a speculation as fact, because it can always be proven wrong. We are still doing research. We're still learning about our past, and it's important for me in my interpretation especially to say, I don't know that yet, because in a matter of time, we will have the answer. Going back to documentation and oral history, though, I think it's important to acknowledge that with some research that's been done into certain groups, there's implicit bias because everyone is biased, but there's also, you got to think about why didn't some of these groups have the opportunity or means to write things down? That in itself could be a way of researching. It's like, okay, well, the only thing we do have is oral history, so we got to be more open-minded in how we consider things as valid or not, because that might be the only thing you have at that time, and it should be included if it can be a teaching opportunity. Another thing too is how we look at some research that has been done in the past is you got to change your perspective. So because all people have bias, you got to think, okay, this is how this person who did this research was looking at it, but let's try to switch our viewpoint. Maybe we get a deeper understanding or a different understanding. So maybe when you don't know the answer, but always keep in mind one day you might, and it has to be through constant and continued research.
Yeah, I think your biggest tool in research in general is the willingness to admit I don't know, and I'm gonna go figure that out. Because a huge amount of my research that I've done, part of the reason why I do have such a breadth of research and why I am asked about a variety of topics and I'm asked to weigh in on a number of things, is because I started by looking at secondary sources and I didn't understand
what secondary
why they were.
sources are.
So a secondary source is when somebody else, or somebody I can make a secondary source, I have. But it's when you look at primary sources, first-person documents, things from the time period that you're researching, you look at all those and then you write something coming to conclusions about those primary sources. So a book about Thomas Jefferson's life is a secondary source, right? For 18th century research, due to the nature of so many of the things going on during this time period, human enslavement, race relations, the honestly massacres in some cases that were happening, horrible things that were happening, a lot of that research is a bit biased. So ignore that stuff. Go back to the primary and just read until you get that mindset of the person that was writing it. And if you don't understand a topic that they're referencing, look up that topic. I mean, you're going to end up in a rabbit hole, but it's the only way to properly get an answer, and especially for these people that didn't get the chance to fully write their own history. It's the only way you're going to get a window into their life, and they deserve to be remembered. We all deserve to be remembered for the change that we imparted on the world.
Thank you for that. I want to say to everyone who's watching, when you come to Colonial Williamsburg, these are the people you're going to meet on the street, the people who've been doing research and thinking about things. And frankly, most of the interpreters are working on something. So when you come here, you'll be really impressed by how much they know and why they know it. There is a question from Tina. In Williamsburg's early Baptist church, did black women have much of a say?
Well, for Williamsburg's Baptist Church, which if you have not been to Colonial Williamsburg, we are currently doing some archaeological excavation on the site of that church. It's on Nassau Street. So that's one reason for you to come just right off the bat. Check out what we're doing. That church, it was established by enslaved black man named Moses, and then he was succeeded by Gowan Pamphlet, who does actually get freed later on. So his congregation, which I think was upwards of 500 people at one point, was free and enslaved blacks and whites. So they were part of the congregation. They were able to come to Gowan and receive the word. They were able to worship together. In terms of holding offices within the congregation and within the church, I don't know that personally, but you have to keep in mind for a good part of the 18th century, when it came to dissenting faiths like the Baptists, they weren't even allowed to call their places of worship churches, because there is only one church at this time, the Church of England. Once the revolution changes and we start moving towards religious freedom, then they can start calling themselves churches. Maybe in some of these congregations, black women had offices that were not official, because again, depending on what faith you practice, sometimes women are excluded from holding positions within the congregation anyway, for different reasons, or official positions, I should say. So I would wager that women had a voice. They were worshiping together, they were coming together, they were praying for free blacks, they were probably performing marriage ceremonies. So that's a way of exercising your voice if you decide you want to be with someone in that relationship. But I don't honestly know. See, I'm showing you right off. I don't know the answer, but I'm going to look that up now. Thank you, Tina.
Yeah, and the good news of that is something in that process that Davia was just describing about the dig that we're doing. There's lots of things we don't. I'm actually working on some of the bigger research components of that project, and there's so many things we don't know. Or the other scary thing is the thing that everyone thinks they know, but we cannot prove one way or the other.
Exactly.
So we're going to learn more and more about that as we go. Are we going to learn everything we want to? Probably not. But it is encouraging to know that we know these relationships exist in terms of the nature of what we're doing, and that's actually part of that context is one of those things you get when you come here. I like this question. It's from Natalie. Did some husbands fear being legally responsible for what their wives might say? There's a few ways. Actually, let's get your perspective, Cody.
Give my perspective?
Yeah, in terms of the relationship between the husband and the wife and how that works.
Okay, fantastic. So for a lot of southeastern and northeastern woodland tribes, right? So we think about, again, folks like Cherokee and Creeks and Shawnees. Marriage is usually to the concept of men go to join their wives' family and clan. The children from that union do not connect to the father's lineage. They are only connected to their mother's lineage. And so in many instances, it's more so do women fear that their husbands might do something that would offend her family and her clan because she's the head of that household, right? And so that's really what it looks like. So when men are, before as they're unmarried, they are pretty much connected to their mother because that's their connection to their community until they become married, in which they join their wife's clan or family for as long as that union lasts.
I love that because it's such a different way of looking at it from what the Europeans were doing, right? Actually, do you want to talk a little bit about that? Just Ren, you'll talk about it. We got other stuff for you.
Yeah, I mean, we have a couple advertisements, a couple little postings in the newspaper of men saying, I have me and my wife, we are not doing anything together, so any deal she makes, anything she says, that's not on me. This is a public notice saying that she makes her own stuff. I mean, so he is disavowing things that she says, and he's doing it publicly. So clearly he did fear what she was going to do. And I mean, we do have, one of the Randolph women had a extremely nasty poem written about her in the newspaper a couple days before Christmas, where it was just, they said she had the tongue of a serpent. So clearly she was speaking. But it was just ragging on her completely. It was just completely tearing her apart. And my understanding of that poem too is it was written anonymously, but everybody knew who it was. They actually did know who wrote the poem as well in the 18th century.
Do you want to talk a little bit about it too?
I mean, I guess it would depend on that relationship again. Different people have different levels of what is acceptable or what they're, maybe there were some cases where men were completely behind their wives and what they said or did because they acknowledged probably that their wives are their own people. Like they're a unit, but they're their own people and they can make their own decisions. One example that does come to mind was with the Ashbys, John Ashby, he was a free black man who bought his wife Anne, who was enslaved, and was able to get her and her children freed over time, which in Virginia in the 18th century, you could only have an enslaved person freed through meritorious service, where the governor's council will agree to free someone if you can prove they deserve to be free. And he uses the justification of her being a good wife to him, a good and faithful wife. But I believe a little bit later, they get divorced, or they separate, I should say. And he makes it known that he's not responsible for anything she does or says, like she's responsible for her own debts, her own business, contracts, things like that. So it could probably change over time as well. Just unfortunately like today, sometimes things change and people have to make that decision. Mm-hmm.
All right, there is a question that I'm actually going to answer quick. And actually, you may want to join me in this process too. And I'm answering this question because I've been doing research on First Baptist, and like I said, we can open it up a little. It says, was the Baptist Church able to keep records? I'm thinking birth, death, and marriage records. Susie, that is a great question. And that is one of the things we go to very quickly. So the fact that you picked that up is a good sign. One of the things that we know about this particular instance is the church here was part of a bigger, there's a governing body, there's a Dover Association. And they were the ones who kind of oversaw that process. The thing that makes the Dover Association and its relationship to the church here so special and so important is the fact that it's a white organization. So Gowan Pamphlet went to them, and the congregation went to them and said, we're going to be part of this. And they said, yeah, absolutely. So some of the stuff we know about the place has to do with what the association happened to hold on to. This is another example when we talk about primary, secondary sources, that we can find people we look for women also in sort of just the way we do with people of color, in sort of weird places, because we can see them pop up here and there. And a great example of this is the thing that, honestly, if you walk in here and you ask the question, what was the population like? Everybody's going to give you the same answer, because it's so important to how we understand the town. Having said that, 27.5% of town were African American women. We don't have a lot to go on there, but it gives us sort of a starting point or a way to think about it, right? So what's that mean? What are they doing? So it begins sort of the beginning of that, and sort of that's very often, I think you would all agree, that sometimes we got to look places you wouldn't think to look. Especially when we talk about groups, and actually, like I said, we're doing this research on the Baptist Church because we're trying to find, because some of this information is going to be in strange places, because that seems to be pretty common, because women and people of color don't always have opportunities to write their own, actually very often don't have opportunities to write their own narrative.
It is say something too, like this project is in conjunction with the actual current members of the church. Like that congregation's still here; they didn't go anywhere. So I think a lot of them who are invested in this project are looking through their own personal family records and family history to see what they can find, because it's very likely some of them are descendants from that original 18th century congregation.
Yep. And this is another one where it's the whole, like, it genuinely takes a village to learn some of this stuff. And it demonstrates the importance of oral history.
Yes.
I would say as well, if you've ever read the book A Fistful of Shells, it's actually about pre- and post-colonial contact West Africa, the culture. He actually has a huge intro narrative talking about how hard the research was to do due to the fact that he had to go to so many different countries and there wasn't a section about the triangle slave trade. There was not a section about enslavement in the 18th and 19th century as it relates to Africa. He had to go to 15 different sections in libraries all over the world because nobody's bothered to combine all this stuff, just due to that intrinsic bias that you sometimes see with research. So he talks about it took so long to do the research because nobody's done the initial legwork that's already done for so many other projects.
Okay, you have anything you want to add?
Sure. I think it's very much similar to that same idea of who's recording the information, right? So we definitely know that women are interacting in a multitude of different ways within these different tribal communities, but they're not really being able to document and record their own stories that's written down. So even though we have these folks who go out into these tribes who are taking notes on how they live and work and things like that, a lot of our stories and our histories about these women and the things that they've done come through those oral histories from going to those communities and interacting with those tribes that still exist today.
This is a question, we've gotten a few variations of the same question, so I'm going to Frankenstein monster this, and I hope Doug and Deanna and Melissa, that will be okay. Thank you for your questions. It goes back to this sort of the records and then an agency. So the question from Doug is, do you know of any examples in the 18th century where women drove or influenced legislation? I would add case law to that. But then also tied to that is also the women who tried to stand up to their rights. Let me see the other one. Yeah, we'll start with that. So those two in particular, how was I saying that? What are these records? And I would say in this instance, let's talk, like I said, legislation, case law. We're going to talk about the government. Who wants to start? Ren, why don't you start?
One of the big court cases that we have in the 18th century, one of the big things that changed a lot of the slave codes was the case of an enslaved woman suing for her freedom on the basis of faith. She says, hey, it says very clearly in the law, in the Church of England, in the Bible, that Christians aren't meant to own other Christians. I'm not just Christian, because it's, has to be specific in the 18th century. I'm a convert to the Church of England. I'm the exact same Christianity as the person who owns me. Therefore, I shouldn't be owned. And that does not end well for her, is what I will say about that. But it does change the law because they realize there's a hole in the law, which is basically, that's how those laws and codes kind of build themselves. They see that there's a hole. They see that there is hypocrisy because the entire, state of human enslavement in America is kind of based on mental gymnastics and a bit of hypocrisy. Every time there's a hole, they patch it with a weird law. Every time there's a little slip up, they patch it with some weird, slapdash thing. And that's basically what our legal system is made of today, kind of. But I mean, you see those cases throughout the entire 18th century. You see women suing to try and change things. And you see in a number of those cases, them actively acknowledging. There's a case of a white woman where her husband abandons her and runs down to North Carolina and starts a new family. Therefore, he's a bigamist. And she sues to be a femme trader, divorced. And they do not grant it to her. It goes all the way up, and they do not grant it to her, not because she doesn't have a valid reason, but because they don't like the precedent that it would set.
I would say definitely reiterating what you're saying about laws sometimes being reactionary throughout the 17th and 18th century, and unfortunately today, sometimes something happens that people don't want to keep happening, they change the law, or something might happen, change the law. A couple examples that come to mind, and this is an important point too, because sometimes people are actively trying to change something, it just takes time, or you need to come back with someone who might have a bit more influence to get something changed. It's 1677, a free black woman named Susanna tries to petition Charles City County Court to not have to pay a tax on herself. And she does not succeed. They don't change that. But in 1769, on behalf of free black fathers, I believe they approach, William Bland?
Richard Bland.
Richard Bland, all these Blands. They approach Richard Bland and say that they want for their wives, their daughters, their free black women and their families to not have to be tithed. And that actually does meet with success. Now, it could be, Richard Bland has a lot of influence. It could be time has changed. We're getting into the revolutionary era, so people are starting to think about things differently in general. But the fact that in one instance, almost 100 years in the past, someone had tried to do the same thing and didn't succeed, and 100 years later, things have started to change, and what they want to accomplish does succeed, I think is important, because there are people actively trying to change things, and just like today, there are people actively trying to change things. It just takes time.
And I think when you're looking at all the different tribes that are in the 18th century, making treaties and negotiations with England, Spain, France, the big key players here, a lot of that is going to be enacted by women, right? So if you think of Queen Kakakoeski from here in the local Tidewater region, who is signing on to treaties on behalf of other different tribes. And then out in the backcountry, those women are the ones who are sitting in council and who are legislating what those treaties are going to look like in regards to trade, military alliance, cessation of land, and et cetera. And so they are actively engaged in shaping the laws that they are binding themselves to with England and France and them.
So I'm going to go back to the question from Melissa, because it is related, like I said, sources. And the way this is phrased is, are there more primary sources from women versus men due to their letter and journal writing? Are there more personal details about women from Williamsburg than men? Since the Williamsburg question specific, who wants to take it? Sorry, shouldn't I do it?
The question is, are there more personal?
Yeah, are there
journals?
more? Are there more? And are there more personal details available for women in Williamsburg other than men? Basically, comparatively, do we have a richer source base than men? Because we know that lots of women write letters and diaries and all that kind of thing.
I guess it would have to be based more on the document. So, you've got a lot of, I would say, court documents in terms of like inventories and wills and deeds, and a lot of times those could be maybe more male-centered, or depending again on what it is. But then when it comes to letters and journals and things like that, sometimes in my own research, have seen more from men. But in terms of how much detail is in that, I don't know. Sometimes, I guess the first one that came to mind is Jefferson, because he literally wrote everything down. But I think about, too, the Bray School here in Williamsburg, which is a charity school to teach free and enslaved black children to read and write, do basic math for the girls sewing. Maybe some of the girls are staying in that school longer, so that would lead them for opportunities to then write more things down. But if they're enslaved, that's going to limit that as well. One thing that I find frustrating personally is sometimes a document, is it in that person's hand? Because I think about like Betty Randolph. She had on one of her inventories for her husband for enslaved people who had gone to the enemy. Did she write that, or did she have somebody else write that for her, even though that's what she wanted written down? So I think it depends. I know that that's kind of a basic answer for a lot of these things we're saying, but that is the truth. You've got so much diversity and variety and different circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the things with the written history as well is it's that intersectionality again. How rich was the person? Could they afford paper for a journal? Could they afford to have that stuff written down? Because a number of cases, people with oral history is how they're keeping their history, is how they're telling those stories. But we as we as a history focused, as written focused in a Eurocentric way, we like the written stuff a lot more. We feel like it has more weight. We really like books, which is, I love some good books, but they tend to have more weight for us than other things. I've seen far more men, diaries and accounts and journals of men than women. With women, oftentimes, like, Dr. Kelly was saying, you have to get creative with figuring out some information about them. The one that keeps on popping into mind is one of our collections people found a note for a tax document for a woman where her child was just born, and she named her. The mother named the daughter, and she named her Freedom, her hopes for her enslaved daughter. That's all we know about her. That's her one piece of written evidence. Is that actually all that she left in this world? Absolutely not. And I'm sure if we were able to track down the family, I bet you there is an oral history. I bet you her family does remember her. But so often, all we have is the paper. That's changing. We're taking into more account the oral histories. We're actually giving credence and rereading things that have been taken, first-person accounts in that way. But we still have a little bit of that bias in us as kind of an institution. Yeah.
As we all look at Cody. You don't have to say that.
No,
you can say that if you want. You don't have to. That's the nice thing about this kind of conversation, right? The question I'm going to ask next is pretty intense. I'm going to say when we answer this question, just so you know, who is this? Nancy. When we answer this question, we're framing it all through the idea of agency and being able to navigate the world. And what we're talking about is sex a man's pleasure or a woman's duty? Or is that a myth? What were the birth control practices? You don't have to take all of it at once. Actually, you want to start, Cody?
That's a good question.
Okay,
That's fantastic. All right, so when we think about kind of relations in the 18th century, right, especially when we start looking at American Indian communities, there is this notion, and it's well documented by Europeans, of the idea of out in the Western country, American Indian women are promiscuous, right? They have relations outside of legal marriage and things like that. But they are traveling willfully out to those different tribal nations to participate in those sexual relations that can be had outside of marriage and outside of the marriages they are currently engaged in here in places like Virginia and South Carolina and New York. And so I think it's interesting when you look at the reflection of Europeans and how they view that promiscuity in the 18th century is more of a commentary on their lack of sexual freedom here in the colonies rather than it is an admonishment of the sexual freedoms that women enjoy within these American Indian communities. Now, when it comes to like birth control, there was something I did come across from a period document which asked about the idea, and it was relayed to the individual who was asking that there was a notion of contraception, but that they didn't prefer to use it. Now, how that plays into later when we're talking about the idea of where you find information on different things, we do know that in Cherokee society in the 1800s, when the new Constitution is put in place, there is a law specifically forbidding women from practicing infanticide. And so when we think about laws being reactionary, right, the idea that there's a specific law that's put in place to stop something is because it was happening prior to that law being put in place. So I think that's one of the things that I always point to is, and there are some conflicting things when it comes to, that I've seen on the idea of multiple relationships, but they're a separate idea to marriage, right? So there are times when you can have relations with people as you choose to, right, consensually, but then there are also marriage, and marriage becomes a very different kind of legally binding union within those communities. And so we've seen relationships that have and develop until they're married, but then once they're married, they kind of commit themselves to that one person, again, for as long as that union lasts. And there are times when people do divorce within these different tribes, and they kind of just part ways and go about their own business. But it gets interesting when you talk about the idea of unions and marriages and relationships.
So
I've researched this heavily.
you do.
So 18th century is a weird time period with English, with the British perspective on this, because we're going through a sexual revolution in the middle of the 18th century. One of the most popular books that was actually sold here in town under, they often sell it under a pseudonym or under like a shortened name, is Fanny Hill, also known as Memoirs of a Woman of Pleasure. It is the first British erotica. It is highly sexual. It is extremely graphic in nature. The main character is a woman who is actively pursuing and enjoying sex. I mean, that is the main character of it. And part of this cultural shift, part of this, the reason why this question comes up, is in the 18th century, you're actually seeing a shift in perspective about who's the sexual creature. Because 17th century perspective, based on midwifery books I've been reading from the 18th century, as well as biological books I've been reading, they actually considered 17th century, women are the sexual creatures that need to get married because the men are the reasonable creatures that must hold back their sexual natures. It's not until really the 19th century where you see this boom in, oh, men are the sexual creatures, and women, women are passive. Women are the ones that need to hold back men. Women don't want sex. That's actually a reverse of what they are fully committing to and believing in the 18th century. So it's opposite of that. And yeah, again, there's graphic depictions of. There's an entire market for graphic depictions of that sort of thing. To be very blunt, there's actually a first-person account in a diary over in England of a man catching women buying little dolls that were actually dildos on the street.
Oh, wow.
Like, they were buying the dolls, and they were sex toys. So, sexual revolution, once again.
I just learned quite a bit myself in that conversation. Oh my goodness. That is a very interesting myth and question, because when you're thinking about just Williamsburg, more than half of the population is enslaved, and a lot of these enslaved people are women. And because these women are not seen as people, they're seen as property. A lot of the sexual encounters that are happening are likely forced, and if they are by choice, you got to think about, okay, is this a choice that this individual is making because they're trying to protect themselves? Is this a choice that they're making that they're trying to protect someone else? One of our interpreters is Aggie of Turkey Island, who was an enslaved woman owned by Ryland Randolph, and she is in a relationship with him because he has picked her to be kind of like his wife, but because there are laws against interracial marriage, she's not seen as that, but it's something that's recognized even if it's not necessarily addressed. And that's just one example. There might be countless examples of, relationships that are maybe out of necessity, maybe out of a willful choice. We don't necessarily know, because it's not something that is talked about very much. And I think another thing that's talked about even less is the reverse, relationships with white women, with black women, and who are enslaved as well. So it's something to think about. It's again, going to be very different based off of each individual.
Very, very quickly, because we are running out of time. One last question, one more statement. What would be the one thing for all the people who have watched it and will watch it that you want them to get out of this video and future study of women's history? Cody, you want to start?
Sure. So it kind of goes back to that idea where we're talking about that small frame of perception of American Indian people because of movies and films and TV. And where we talk about these things in the past, right? This is in the 18th century, hundreds of years ago. Today, there are 576 federally recognized tribes in the United States who still exist, who occupy spaces as modern people. And that means that there are American Indian women who occupy those same spaces in a multitude of different ways. I mean, they're doctors, they're lawyers, they're teachers, they're artisans, they're soldiers, right? And so when we think about these women, it's simply a continuation of our history to our present day, that these women still do exist and occupy very prominent spaces in our lives.
Yeah, I would definitely say that it is a continuation of our study of our story, and it is crucial that if you're watching this video or if you watch it later, this is not just your start and stop. This is your start. You continue to look into information. You continue to think about the subject. You continue to talk about it, and let that inform not just your knowledge, but also your power, the choices that you make in regards to your own life, if you are a woman, how you interact with other women, if you're a male, how you interact with women, how you interact with, this needs to be a tool. Knowledge is only useful if you apply it to your own life.
Yeah. I would say that keep going, keep learning. I heard one of the interpreters that used to work here, Cheney McKnight, she said something very beautiful the other day. She said, she is trying to live in the fullness of her truth, and how she's doing that is by researching and fully understanding what people in this country went through, what her ancestors personally went through, the struggles of all these different groups, of the different people that make up this country. Part of the reason why our culture can be so beautiful is because it's so different, and taking out certain people's stories as not important is just removing a part of the beauty of our own story, and there's no reason for it. Yeah.
Unfortunately, that is all the time we have. I want to thank our wonderful and talented panelists that you can see when you come visit. For their insight and knowledge of not only just women's history, but also the importance of studying women. We're grateful that you joined us today and sending us so many great questions. This program was made possible by a generous grant from Ferguson Enterprises, and we thank them and all of our donors for their support. It is only because of you that we can share a complete and engaging story of the nation. We're so glad you took the time to join us today, and hope that you will visit us soon here in Williamsburg. Have a wonderful day.